страшный диагноз тяжело принять. И отдельному человеку, и обществу в целом. В психологии есть теория 5 стадий проживания горя. Сначала пациент отрицает свою болезнь, затем проходит гнев, торг, депрессию, и только после этого смиряется с неизбежным.
И так будет всегда.
В 20 веке этот путь прошла Германия. Сегодня трудно поверить, что всего 80 лет назад эта страна болела нацизмом, уничтожала народы и стирала с лица земли целые города. Как немцы прошли свой путь от отрицания к принятию, от нацизма к процветающей демократии? В начале 1930-х мировой экономический кризис усугубил внутренние проблемы Германии, накопившиеся после поражения в Первой мировой войне. Многие немцы потеряли работу, пребывали в упадническом настроении и ждали того, кто сможет вывести страну из кризиса.
I won't explain everyone here on the picture, but of course Adolf Hitler as the so-called Führer, the leader of the party.
Дирк Ридель работает в документационном центре истории национал-социализма в Мюнхене. Экспозиция этого музея рассказывает о причинах появления и последствиях диктатуры Третьего Рейха.
In 1933, Hitler really seized to power. There are several different reasons. Germany had lost the First World War and now was in a very complex situation. Many people were poor. They had a hyperinflation, looking for more leading structures, for someone who is the leader again. And Hitler was the one who offered them, if you vote me, I will give you some structure and I will tell you what to do. National Socialist Party. They did not want to have only an administration, but they also wanted to control the German culture and to combine what is German culture and what is National Socialist culture. And every child in Germany should be raised by thinking it is my duty to give my life for Hitler, for the German nation and so on. So it was a very brutal, men-dominated cult around National Socialism.
Гитлер принес долгожданные перемены. Немецкое общество, очарованное фюрером и его идеей, что Германия превыше всего, было на подъеме. Люди не заметили, как за это они начали постепенно расплачиваться собственной свободой и правами, а многие и своей жизнью.
My name is Friedrich Hindenberg. I'm a freelance software developer, 37 years old, and I've been living in Berlin for 12 years, originally from the southwest of Germany. I think in Berlin in particular, it's kind of unavoidable that every street corner has a kind of surprising amount of history to it, and I find it really fascinating. You can almost take someone to Berlin and just spend 2 weeks seeing all the ways that German history has gone wrong. And I don't know if that's a great visit for anyone. Jews have to hand in all of their electrical and optical devices, bicycles, typewriters, and gramophones. It seems so petty, right? Like when the government makes you hand in your music and your bicycle. I mean, how petty can you get in terms of just terrorizing people? It's about like making life more difficult, and yeah, the gramophone really annoys me, right? Because like the only reason you take a gramophone from someone is because it's a nice thing to happen. It's making your life prettier. Or a typewriter, right? You need a typewriter to share your thoughts, write up what's happening in the world. So if you take that away from someone, that's leaving them without a means to express themselves. That's also quite demonic.
Эти таблички с выдержками из антисемитских законов появились в баварском квартале Берлина в 1993 году, как напоминание о преступлениях нацистского режима и о том, как в стране поступали с теми, кого власти объявили врагами.
I'm just the exact type of person that would have been involved in those crimes back then, right? I'm a normal German dude, slightly upper middle class. I would have probably been in the army at this point in Nazi Germany, right? To me, it was always like a question of like, if I were ever to live through such a period, just kind of knowing about the history doesn't give me an insurance from the future, right? What could I teach myself? That if this happened, I would not be one of the ones that kind of joins the chorus of nationalism and this mania, right? But that is immune to nationalist insanity. How could I be sure that I, as an individual, would not become part of such a movement? It's something that I almost envy the current generation of Russians for. You guys have the answer to like, what would I have done, right? You had like a moral compass that told you this is like a political environment that shouldn't be and that I don't want to be part of, and that you actually took your personal lives apart and took those radical personal consequences just because you felt that like the politics was not one that you wanted to even be a passive participant in, right? I imagine that anyone in Russia right now could get a job as an accountant, as a shop clerk, as something. You could just kind of try and weather it, but actually going out is quite the statement and quite the act in itself.
Став рейхсканцлером, Гитлер в считанные недели разгромил оппозицию. Несогласные были частью убиты, а частью рассажены по тюрьмам, места в которых быстро закончились, и для перевоспитания национал-предателей создали концентрационные лагеря.
So here you see a picture which was taken from Dachau concentration camp, and this was taken in 1938. It was a propaganda picture by a German propaganda photographer. This is what was published in German propaganda as well. If people look at this picture, they can see men in prisoners' uniforms. And of course, they could think, yes, they are a threat to the German nation, and we have to be grateful that there is a concentration camp. This is what the Nazi propaganda wanted people to think. There were people who tried to think critically about it, but there were also people who didn't want to ask any critical questions, but who wanted to have their convenience and who did not want to discuss, who didn't want to be in danger as well, because they knew it could be dangerous to ask the wrong questions or to be too inconvenient. So it's these two sides in the end, I think.
Бернхард Шлинк – немецкий юрист и писатель, автор бестселлера «Чтец», по которому был снят одноименный фильм. Это роман об осмыслении преступлений нацистского режима.
My father was a theologian, and he had been a professor up until 1938, and then the National Socialists closed the theological school, so he couldn't be a professor anymore. He became a pastor. My father, did he feel guilty? I remember my mother telling us in 1943 there was a faint chance that he might become a professor again. So he went to Berlin, where he had friends in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and talked to them. And they not only told him that the war is lost, but also he learned about the Holocaust from them. And my mother said she'll never forget how he came back from Berlin to Bielefeld, where we lived. And he was completely destroyed to learn what was happening to the Jews in the East.
There were people living in Germany who were anti-Semites, who were racists, and they believed what Hitler told them. Hitler was telling a lot of lies. People had economical problems, and Hitler told them, I know who is guilty for this, it's the Jews living in Germany. which is ridiculous, of course, but this was a simple explanation, and there were people who believed in his lies.
Everybody knew that they were deported. And what exactly happened to them? Some ghettos in Poland, in the Ukraine. I think who really wanted to know might have had a chance to talk to soldiers who fought in the East and to know something about the killing. But many soldiers didn't want to talk about it, and many people weren't too interested to learn what was happening.
This is something I don't understand. You see Ukraine, you see the country, you see the ruins and so. What do they see that in Russia, and what? How do they explain that as an action for friends or against Nazis? I mean, the Russians came into the country. How do they explain that?
I think there are, like everywhere, people are happy if they have, like, let's say, strong leadership of their country. Obviously, you want to have someone making choices for you.
I don't think there's any value in sort of measuring up regimes of insanity. And I think especially the Holocaust is sort of a thing that, I don't know, I would fundamentally defend it against any comparison, right? Because it's just such a unique amount of suffering that was caused. I mean, of course, there's like lots of parallels in what at least I read in the media about what weird currents of historical belief combine with fears and concerns about the future and about where you are in the world, right? And that leading to this weird kind of defensive paranoia. It's cocooning from reality, right? It's like building your own reality because the facts on the ground don't allow you the honor or the dignity that you'd like to have. I don't know.
There are some parallels, of course, if you look at the structures, how a dictatorship can be built up, how someone organizes his propaganda, and how he's talking about those who are called the enemies. So these simple solutions.
Вся идеология и пропаганда в современной России построена вокруг милитаризма и сакральной даты – 9 мая. Многие россияне отмечают День Победы как праздник своего величия, вне зависимости от того, где они находятся.
Прадедушка дошел до Берлина, Рейхстаг брал.
Так как для меня только есть 3 праздника в году. Это Рождество, это Остен, Пасха и, соответственно, 9 мая. Приехали отдать память и честь, показать дедов своих.
Мы хотим показать, что мы, украинцы, тоже, наши деды, тоже они воевали там. И мы хотим показать, что мы сейчас страдаем от этой русской агрессии, у нас война.
Украина вообще не касается нас. Причем здесь Украина? Мы пришли почтить память наших дедов, которые воевали, которые были инвалидами после этой войны. А Украина здесь вообще не при чем.
Подивіться, що там твориться. Ці люди святкують, ці люди бухають, ці люди танцюють під Катюша, вже сонце нагріло, вони вже п'яні всі.
Да от провокатори хохлядські. Россия, в этом слове огонь и сила.
Ура!
Россия, Донбасс!
Донбас!
Ура!
Вони просто бачать нас, ми йдемо, нікому не заважаємо. Вони Бандера, Бандера, це така, ми фашисти, нацисти. Сьогодні на мене чоловік в очі, в камеру сказав, що нас Путін вбиває і правильно робить.
Мы победим. Все будет хорошо. Россия, Донбасс и мы все немцы, которые живем здесь, а мы с вами.
Нас к торжеству коммунизма ведет.
Для Европы, и в частности для Германии, памятная дата – это 8 мая. В этот день здесь вспоминают погибших во Второй мировой войне.
I think normally the 8th of May is a super quiet day in Germany, right? There's little memorials that are being held or little events, but really it's not a organized day where big political rallies happen, right? It's more a day where I think people try to remember what happened and try to maybe reflect it a bit.
It's a very important day for Germans, and I think for everybody who's aware of the risks and the sorrow of war. This year, I think it's a very special day because, as we all are aware of how much grief and cruelty war brought and still brings, I think in the special situation of the Ukraine war today and nowadays, we even should think more about how to avoid war.
Но как немцы, которые были одержимы идеей своего превосходства, смогли побороть вирус нацизма и превратить свою страну в одну из самых открытых и развитых в мире?
It's a small footage through the center of Munich. 90% of the center of Munich was destroyed during World War II. What we have to know, of course, the beginning of the war was by Germans. But in the end, the war comes back to Germany. And this is what we can see here. It's not the fault by the elites, but the fault is the National Socialists in Germany beginning the war.
Well, the situation in 1945 was very difficult for people. People had believed in this regime. People were disappointed. During the dictatorship, people were told and people wanted to believe that what they did was okay. It was according to the rule of the dictatorship. They could dispossess other people, they could profit from other people's misfortune, they could persecute other people, they could put other people into concentration camps and not being put on trial.
После войны начались трибуналы. Самый известный из них – Нюрнбергский процесс над главными нацистскими преступниками. Перед судом предстали руководство Третьего Рейха, командование Вермахта и пропагандисты.
But at the same time, there are millions of people who profited, who collaborated, who participated, who did small things. What about the hundreds and thousands of people who had supported the regime, who were party members, who had fought in the war, and who had taken part in this crime in some way or another? In fact, not many of them were put on trials.
После войны перед победителями встала непосильная задача. Одних только бывших членов Национал-социалистической партии Германии насчитывалось более 8 миллионов человек. Чтобы оценить степень вины каждого немца, гражданам раздали анкеты. В них было более 100 вопросов о том, что человек делал во время нацистского режима. Но оказалось, что скрыть свое прошлое очень легко. Лишь немногих комиссии и трибуналы квалифицировали как преступников. Сертификат об успешном прохождении денацификации в народе стали называть по аналогии с немецким стиральным порошком – персил. Получение этого документа означало, что человек смог отбелиться.
A lot of what happened after the war was that the same institutions, the same people kind of just continued to exist for a long time, right? If you have a country of 80 million people, you need, let's say, 10,000 judges, right? And so at the end of World War II, there were no 10,000 judges in Germany that hadn't enforced the kind of laws that we're seeing on the signs here, right? Every single one had done it. Maybe there were like 50 judges who had escaped the country and could now come back. But so everybody just remained in office, right? Everybody stayed in their place. All the civil servants, all the judges, all the prosecutors who'd been actively involved in doing all this stuff.
Some of them, they were put in prison for a couple of years. They were put on trial. Some of them were in Soviet POW camps for a couple of years and then returned. And in fact, there was a lot of continuity. A lot of teachers returned to university. A lot of teachers returned to schools. Lawyers returned to their offices. And that was a big problem because these people didn't want to reflect upon their crimes. They didn't want to reflect on what happened in the regime. People who had profited, who had gotten an apartment, furniture, a car, a company.
Церковь разрушенная во время войны. Это силуэт. Таких мест много у нас. Мы находимся в фонде «Память ответственности будущего». Фонд был основан в 2000 году. Мы расположены в Берлине, в самом центре. Я руководитель отдела поддержки проектов в фонде. С одной стороны, мы поддерживаем жертв нацизма, которые еще живут среди нас, не только в Германии, но в основном в Восточной Европе, то есть в Польше, в Чехии, в странах бывшего Советского Союза. Во-вторых, это у нас образование в области истории, что произошло 75 лет назад, какие причины вели к диктатуре и к Второй мировой войне. Немцы, конечно, вели войну, да. Они использовали принудительный труд. Они завоевали почти весь Европу, да. И они совершили небывалые преступления. С другой стороны, немцы тоже себя чувствовали как жертвы. После войны существовал голод, и миллионы немцев потеряли свои дома. Восточные территории ушли от Германии. Так что, с одной стороны, они совершали вот эти преступления, с другой стороны, они были жертвы.
Военные трибуналы, конфискация трофейного имущества, навешивание ярлыков – все это было унизительно для немцев.
И что получилось? После войны, за исключением меньшинства, большинство продолжало считать себя жертвами. То есть вот военное поколение, оно в большинстве воспринимало себя как жертву. Жертва Гитлера и жертва войны. Они не воспринимали себя как ответственные за Гитлера. Они не поняли, не хотели вспомнить, что они избрали Гитлера. Да? Нацисты пришли к власти. Откуда они пришли? С Марса или из Франции? Непонятно. Они пришли и потом ушли.
Пастор Мартин Немёллер был одним из первых, кто публично признал вину Германии за многочисленные преступления. Во время нацистского режима он не боялся критиковать Гитлера, за что 8 лет отсидел в концлагерях. После войны пастор ездил по стране с проповедями о жертвах нацизма и необходимости покаяния. Большинство немцев в ответ освистывали его и называли предателем.
We are at the Sachsenhausen Memorial and Museum. This was a concentration camp from 1936 to 1945. Everywhere and every day happened terrible things. People were killed, were tormented. The whole site is a place of terror and murder and suffering. The largest mass murder that took place in Sachsenhausen was the killing of 13,000 Soviet prisoners of war immediately after the German invasion into the Soviet Union in late summer and autumn 1941, when the Nazis made millions of prisoners of war in the first months of the war. And in the prisoners of war camps, they selected so-called commissars and political activists and did send them to concentration camps in order to kill them. And so here in Sachsenhausen, more than 30,000 died. 10,000 were killed by shooting within 8 weeks. For Germany, it was very important to remember and to study the history of the National Socialist regime, which took many years. Immediately after the war, nobody talked about the crimes and what happened during the National Socialist time.
There wasn't much between 45 and the 60s. And for a long time I thought the Germans had suppressed the memory. Well, it began in the late 50s, and it began with a case. There was one soldier, officer, SS officer, who had been part of the Einsatzgruppen in the East, who killed the Jews and the partisans. And then he wanted his pension. And I think he got something very minor, but he thought, I'm an SS officer, I have to get more. And that brought it up. But mainly it was in the mid-60s, the Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt. That, at least for my generation, was the first strong experience of what had happened in the concentration camps.
В 1963 году, спустя почти 20 лет после окончания войны, перед судом предстали 22 сотрудника концлагеря Аушвиц. Процесс громко освещался в прессе. Его обсуждала вся Германия, но большинство граждан не ассоциировали себя с обвиняемыми. Более того, 57% немцев не поддержали идею дальнейших судов над нацистскими преступниками.
People are so busy with starting a new life. It takes 15 years before one can turn back and look at the past. So in the mid-60s it was the right time. After 15, 20 years, one was able to look back. One had managed to survive and build up a new life. And then, in many families, the conflicts between the generations began. The young generation felt, what does this old generation have to teach us? Why should we take them seriously?
Они поняли, что их родители, у них есть что-то, что они скрывают. И они открыли для себя вот то, что их родители, они были преступники в том или другом мире. И потом они стали спросить дедушки и бабушки, а что вы сделали во время Третьего Рейха?
Young people asked their parents, what have you done during the war? And then parents had to answer. This was when a public discussion began about what kind of responsibility the parents' generation had. You know, in some places there was more exchange. It was not like the whole society was engaged in this conversation. It started in little bubbles, in intellectual bubbles, and writers and the universities started to reflect. The historians really played an important role. And then through movies that came from the United States, but also movies that were made here, this topic was, discussed in a larger context. This was when a shift started.
I think this was a question that my whole generation asked. I think there is guilt because you did something evil. That's the clear case. But there's another kind of guilt if you keep those who did something evil within your solidarity. If you keep liking them, loving them. I found an early example of it in legal history. The old tribes had the rule that if one member of one tribe killed a member of the other tribe, the first tribe had the choice between expelling the member who committed the crime, or if they kept him within their solidarity, they as a tribe became responsible. And I think there's a deep truth.
Старшее поколение не хотело выглядеть преступниками в глазах своих детей, а молодые немцы искали правды, которая нередко была слишком тяжелой.
My generation, we love our parents. We're grateful to our teachers or our professors, or there was this doctor who helped me when I was sick as a child again and again. And then you find out, then you learn the doctor was an SS doctor and involved in something, or your father or your uncle or your teacher was involved in something. Then some really broke with their parents, completely and totally. And that's one option. But most of us didn't do that and couldn't do that. And that's where this feeling of second guilt came from. We keep loving them, we keep them within our solidarity and community. We don't expel them. And that entangles us into their guilt.
В годы войны немецкие компании использовали рабский труд миллионов заключенных и пленных. Понимание того, можно ли считать это преступлением, пришло к немцам не сразу.
Это были тысячи компаний, но самые известные — это Daimler, Volkswagen, Siemens, Bosch. Долгое время после войны никто не заботился об этом. Все считали это нормально. Это была война. Люди были депортированы в Германии, они работали, ну и что? И только в 80-е годы возникло такое общественное сознание, шаг за шагом, что это ненормально, что это часть преступления и что люди заслуживают внимания, уважения и в конце концов денег.
Дискуссия о степени вины немецкого общества вышла на государственный уровень. Бывшим подневольным рабочим удалось добиться компенсации через американские суды.
Был найден компромисс, чтобы немецкие компании и немецкое правительство вместе предоставят 10 миллиардов марок, если человек сидел в концлагере, он получил 15 тысяч марок. На сегодняшний день это 7500 евро. Это, конечно, немного. Это очень немного. С другой стороны, это больше, чем если бы наш президент сказал только «извините».
Yeah, it's meant to suck you in, and it's super claustrophobic. You come down here and you can kind of feel how everything is kind of bending over you and how you're being constrained and forced. Whenever I look at my passport, I'm like very happy to see that it says European Union on top and then it says Germany below. I love like this idea as a perspective of being a European citizen, but obviously that's a lie, right? I'm part of Germany, and Germany is treating its people well, right? Like we live in extreme wealth here, we live in extreme comfort, safety. And so in that sense, being German is a fantastic thing, right? It comes with this weird baggage of being a nation that threw the 20th century into absolute horror. And how that fits together is extremely strange, right? How can you have like a country that's doing so well for its people at times and then at other times decides to randomly kill millions of them?
This one, it says, "I'm proud to be a German." So this is someone who says, I'm not interested in National Socialism, but there are so many prominent Germans, important Germans, so I'm still proud to be a member of the German nation. And this picture on the same building, and there wrote someone down KZ Dachau, Verden, Buchenwald, so these are concentration camps. I feel bad to be a German. So I have bad feelings thinking about these concentration camps and being a German.
And at the same time, I always thought and still think, you can't get it out of you. You are German. It is your identity and you have to accept it. And yes, I'm German. For better or for worse. And I can be a critical German and I can distance myself from many things and I can express that there are parts of my history that I think are awful and criminal, and I'm suffering under knowing this as part of my history, but I can't escape my history and my German identity.
В 1970 году канцлер Германии Вилли Брандт приехал в Польшу с официальным визитом. Впервые немецкий политик такого уровня посетил мемориал жертвам нацистского режима в бывшем варшавском гетто. Подойдя к нему, он опустился на колени. Поступок Брандта произвел фурор. Почти половина немцев сочла это чрезмерным жестом, но 41% жителей Германии поддержали канцлера.
One topic was not addressed for a long time, and that was the responsibility of people who served in the army. There was a narrative that the simple private who served in the army was not to blame. And then in the 1990s, an exhibition toured through Germany and Austria, which discussed the crimes of the German army. And this was a big shift because a lot of people went to see this exhibition. There was a lot of protest against it. People would go there and they would complain and would say like, but this makes my father a war criminal. I cannot ask him anymore. And it started a discussion which, destroyed the myth that the German army was always okay. Because there was a certain myth that said the German army never took part in these war crimes. They never took part in mass killings, they never took part in the Holocaust by bullets, and so on. This turned out to be wrong because a lot of these crimes could be traced to members of the German army. It changed the perspective of a lot of people on this issue. A lot of former soldiers went to see this exhibition and some said, oh, this is not what we did. And others would say, well, exactly that's what we did.
There's stones that have been set here. They show the name, date of birth, and the fate of someone who was a Jewish inhabitant of this house and was killed in the Holocaust. So in this case, for example, it is Hulda Heller. She was born in 1863, deported in 1942, sent to Theresienstadt, one concentration camp, and then murdered in Treblinka. I almost feel like they're invisible inhabitants of the house, right, in some weird way. It's like people who live there and whose children should be living here right now, and that was just erased.
We should take that spirit with us, that spirit that in many ways is talking about the uncomfortable past and bringing that into our future visions of society. That is always an act of resistance because it is uncomfortable. It's never easy. The moment you have the feeling that you're entirely satisfied with how you look at the past of a country, of a society, and how you've dealt with it, then it's getting a little dangerous.
The whole process took like an entire generation of people to go through, right? So there's by no means is this like a thing that Germany kind of ended up doing by its own volition and immediately, right? It's more a thing that happened through lots and lots of fights and lots of ugly truth coming out way later than they should have, right? And that's like 40 years of generational fight, much more than anything else.
I don't have problems with discussing the things which happened, what happened in families, what happened in history. That's very normal. You discuss it, you make your own opinion about it, and that's it. And you don't make a secret out of it. That's important. Ask anybody. Nobody has a secret about it. Everybody knows that the grandfather probably was a Nazi. So.
This is a museum, a center for education and learning, which opened its doors in 2015. It was built on a historical site, on a very highly contested spot. This was where the Brown House, the Nazi party headquarters, had been. But Munich always remained symbolically the birthplace of the movement and kind of the aesthetically also the central place for the Nazis. In front of this building, there used to be two so-called temples of honor, two buildings that were erected like Greek temples that should honor the first victims of the Nazi movement. These were the people who were killed in the beer hall Putsch in 1923 here in Munich when the Nazis made their first attempt to take over the power, but they didn't succeed. So they brought the remnants of these people in coffins here to these temples, and they were honored. There was an SS guard was standing next to it, and many Nazi rallies happened here. Allies destroyed them after 1945, and what was left was the base. The base couldn't be taken off because there were tunnels underneath. So those two bases remained there. One of them is already covered in trees and bushes. The other one is just covered in bushes, and little animals live there. There are rabbits and birds and so on. And you could say this is, Munich prime real estate. And some people ask, what is this? It's like a scar in the city landscape. It doesn't have any purpose. It doesn't have any sense. It's just the base of what used to be a temple of honor for dictatorship. But the idea was, and it was a conscious decision that was made by the city council to leave it like that, as a monument that is in connection with this museum, makes itself understandable. People have to think, what is going on here? Because there is no explanation, there is no sign, there is no description.
It's the so-called Odeonsplatz, or a small road next to Odeonsplatz. And the National Socialists built up a monument here. You see the swastika up there, and the names were on this monument of the members of the National Socialist Party. And they wanted everyone who came across should lift the right arm and say, Heil Hitler. Those people who didn't want to do this, they could use another road and to go around this monument. So they didn't have to came across the monument, and there were some people in Munich who obviously did this because they didn't want to lift their right arm and to honor Adolf Hitler.
До сих пор о войне и нацистском режиме многое напоминает в городах Германии. Немцы не стали стирать из памяти темные страницы своей истории и сделали их открытыми для всех желающих.
Many visitors come to Sachsenhausen from all over the world. We had more than 700,000 visitors every year here at Sachsenhausen. Just in the neighborhood there is the police academy of the state of Brandenburg. They use former buildings of the SS barracks, which were part of the former concentration camp complex. And many of the students of the police academy visit also the memorial site. We have, of course, an educational department. We also try to convince schools not only to book a tour, but to stay here for a whole day, for a study day. So the students have time to work themselves with sources, material about the history, that they have the opportunity to learn more about biographies of prisoners who were here in Sachsenhausen, that they have a time to discuss what they learned and what they experienced here.
В Баварии посещение концлагеря входит в обязательную школьную программу.
I feel like Germany does a pretty good job in teaching people how our history was and what bad sides it had and why it even happened as it happened. And I feel like we learned a lot in school, but we also learn a lot outside from school.
We, for example, visited a KZ and so on, so we really face history as far as possible. In Dachau, this is what every pupil, at least in Bavaria, needs to visit. So it's,
if you go to school, you have to visit it at least once. So we were pretty young, but I feel like the teachers, but also the people there who showed us the place and so, were pretty supporting. So of course it was really, it was hard and it was really sad to see, but I feel like they had a pretty good way of combining that with teaching us and looking at the bright side in the future.
German school is almost funny in the way that you have history classes, and the first history class maybe is about prehistoric ages, right? And then the next grade almost, it feels like, is about the Nazi time. Then you have a school grade about the Romans. Then comes another lesson about the Nazi times. Then you have a school grade about the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution. Then you have another little lesson about the Nazi times. So it's kind of almost every history, I think, year in Germany has some reminder of it in some shape, I feel.
So for us, it's really important to make this connection between the history, the historic legacy, and the responsibility that we, in this country, in Germany, that has brought upon Europe and the world a disastrous war with millions and millions of casualties, what kind of responsibility we have to remember this past, to talk about it in the present, and to use it as a tool to build a different kind of future. So for us, this is really sort of at the heart of the German democracy, is reflecting upon what has happened and what kind of responsibility Germany has.
You have to look back, and of course you have to see all the things that are awful, but I think you have to try to understand why people acted the way they acted. And condemning them from a high moral ground is not enough. You don't learn from history by just condemning from a high moral ground. You only learn if you understand. One has to look at the situations of these people if one wants to learn something. And I think the threat of the authoritarian is far from over. And we have to learn from history how to counter what's coming. And we don't learn just by feeling morally good because we are much better and what they did is awful, but we would never have done it because it's morally wrong. That's way too simple.
Many things that happened here in terms of thinking about the past, thinking about the special responsibility that Germany has, happened with small initiatives, you know, people that wanted to know more about the history of their town, of their family, who asked around. There are many of those initiatives all over the country, and it's important that we support them and that we involve people and include people in this talk about the past and in the talk about democratic values, because this is something we cannot force people into. You have to sort of include people and persuade them that life in a democracy is sometimes messy, but it's really worth to have this messy situation, to constantly reflect what is going on, how do we treat each other, what kind of respect do we expect from each other, what are the values, what are the core values of a society.
Рекомендую вам, идите на Потсдамер плац, там есть выставка «Открытие на свежем воздухе». Там портреты немцев, сегодняшних немцев. И если вы смотрите в их глаза, лица, И именно вы понимаете, что сегодняшние немцы — это не те немцы, как себе Гитлер их представил. Так арийские, да. Это сейчас немцы, мы миграционное общество. Разные люди, разные истории. И все они вместе живут здесь.
Friede, Freiheit, Recht und Wahrheit leuchten hell auf unserem Pfad, Widerstände zu bezwingen.
It's sometimes even beautiful to see people who are like in political positions that I absolutely find disgusting, just kind of standing there and trying to make their case. And maybe you can argue with them, or you just walk by and kind of notice, wow, there's someone who thinks this. A couple of years ago, they would then maybe set a car on fire, but then the police would also come in and they would then start beating up the protesters, and then the protesters would start throwing rocks at the police. And to me, it almost feels like exercise for like trying to be sure that we have it in ourselves to do a riot if need be. It feels like a training run for a day on which state authority must be questioned in Germany again.
Societies are societies, people are people, nationalism is nationalism, and we can see now in many countries in the world that people turn to authoritarian leaders, that people are being convinced that strong leaders are a solution in a situation of many different crises.
In Germany we have the national anthem and we don't sing the first two stanzas of it. Part of it is it says Germany above everything else. That's a bad idea, we've found out. But it also has like very specific geographic distinctions. Germany basically after the World War II completely redefined its geography. What used to be Germany is now Poland, and that basically nobody in Germany gives a second thought about it. In order to have peace in Europe, Germany just needed to be much smaller than it was. Yeah, it needed to kind of also lose something at the end of the Second World War, right? So nobody in Germany nowadays, I think literally nobody, has any thought as to should the city of Danzig or the city of Königsberg, Kaliningrad, go back to Germany, right?
Also, it's important to develop a democratic, open culture because the remembrance how easily a modern society like the German has been during the Weimar Republic could change into a, well, terrible, brutal regime which killed millions of people and caused a war nearly over the complete world. Also for us, absolutely important to remember how easily that can start and to be carefully watching what happens in our society to stop any developments going into this direction.
And I think this is something that we are seeing, that every day there is a new challenge, that history is posing a new challenge every day for our work, and we're never done.
The parking lot where the Reichskanzlei was, basically the bunker that Hitler was in at the end of the war, right? That's basically Hitler's grave, and it's just a parking lot. And I think that's quite charming. The idea is basically that having any sort of grave for Hitler would be risky, right? Because Nazis would meet there and do whatever the fuck. And so this is the best thing that he gets, is a parking lot that's not even with concrete on it.